Okay, so let's start with the prayers that we normally do tonight, though. Let's just do the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha 3 times, and then we'll go forward and do the mandala offering and the refuge prayer. So page 73, that first prayer 3 times. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Then go forward to either page 97 or 98, depending on the version of the prayer book you have. We're going to do the short mandala offering prayer. I'll just do that first verse there in English. And then on page 98, there's the offering mantra. And then after that, we'll do refuge and bodhicitta before the teaching. That next prayer, once in English, twice in Tibetan. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chunyen Gi Peso Nam Gi Drola Penshir Sangye Drupar Shok Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chunyen Gi Peso Nam Gi Dola Penshir Sangye Drupar Shok. Okay, you can set the prayer books aside and we'll do a short meditation next before we begin the class. And so find a good meditation posture, just settling into a posture that's upright, but also relaxed. And then if there's a technique that you already use to work with the breath, you can use that. And if not, I'll suggest working with this point at the tip of the nose, where you feel the sensation of the air coming in and out of the nostrils. Making that your meditation object, just try to stay present with the breath. And in any meditation on the breath, our goal is to be vigilant to watch when we lose our awareness of the breath, when our attention wanders, and we get distracted. So if that occurs, then try to notice that, let go of whatever it was that distracted you, and gently return to the breath. So I'll ring the chime. We'll do this in silence for just a few minutes, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection to set motivation for tonight. So now let's set our motivation of bodhicitta. In the traditional Lamrim teachings, we see that there are actually 3 levels of motivation, the third one being bodhicitta. So let's reflect on these briefly tonight before we begin, trying to relate our studies of minds and mental factors to the Lamrim. So the very beginning of the Lamrim is where we're focused on our next rebirth, trying to do what we can to affect through our actions the results that we'll have at the end of this life, the rebirth that we will go to in the next life and even beyond that, to at least create a continuity of good rebirth so that we can continue this spiritual path. And so we need to know about our minds in order to accomplish that. While most of the actions we're trying to curtail are physical actions and verbal actions, those don't arise independent of our minds. So we can apply our understanding of minds and mental factors to that first level of the Lamrim, our desire to use this life meaningfully to at least create the causes for a good rebirth, to have that assurance that when this life ends, we will be able to continue to have a meaningful, fulfilling life. Then in the middle scope, we go beyond the desire for a good rebirth, to recognize that as long as we are under the control of our karma and delusions, we will continue to go from life to life in samsara, this state of cycling. And it's essential then that we understand our own minds, that we understand particularly the afflictions that we're going to start studying tonight, because these have to be overcome. We have to eliminate the afflictions from the root by eliminating the ignorance that is the cause of all of our suffering. So here we generate that motivation, desiring for our own freedom from being under the control of those factors, our own attainment of nirvana, the peace that comes when we have eliminated all of those disturbing emotions and thereby liberated ourselves from the cycle of existence. So generate that motivation and that understanding of why it is essential to know this topic very well. And then we arrive at the third level of the Lamrim, that of for the person of the greatest capacity, where we go beyond our own situation by recognizing that every other being is in the exact same predicament as ourselves. Every single being is under the control of these same factors, going from life to life, never knowing any true peace. And it would be very selfish of us to simply be concerned about our own welfare. So we need to know our own minds, but we also need to know how to help others to learn about their minds. So at this level of the great scope of this motivation of bodhicitta that strives to become a Buddha for the sake of others, we generate the intention to study this topic so that we can most clearly understand our own minds, so that we can help others to do the same. We can help others to generate the wisdom and all the virtuous mental factors that will help to overcome all of the delusions, all of the negative states. Help them to achieve Buddhahood as well. So in this way, we can see that at all 3 levels of the Lamrim, it's essential that we know this topic very well. But try to arrive at that highest motivation, that motivation of bodhicitta, that strives to use the time we have here tonight together to achieve enlightenment for the sake of all beings. And hold that very deeply in your heart. Make that become the most important reason why you are studying this topic, why you are engaging in this tonight. Okay, so in the last class, which was our first class after the break while I was away, we went through an introduction to the basic program, which was to give all of you some information in case you do decide at some point that you'd like to pursue studies of the basic program at a more a deeper level with the aim for certification in this program. Then we also began to review what we did in the last class, or I'm sorry, in the last set of classes when I was here previously. And so we went through the various mental factors that were in the omnipresent category, the 5 that are always with us throughout all of our states of mind. In general, there are, again, some exclusions to that, but we can say those 5 are operating almost all the time. We went through the 5 object determining mental factors that are there whenever we are relating to an object, whether it be with a wholesome mind or an unwholesome mind. And then we went through the kind of introduced very briefly the virtuous mental factors. That's where we kind of left off, which was the 3rd category that we looked at previously. So I wanted to start from there, unless there were any questions from last time. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on the virtuous ones because we did spend a fair amount before, but let me go ahead and get the slides up on the screen for those at home. Oh, I've got my little error message now, Stephen, that I was just talking about. So I'm going to have to close that out and open that up again. 1 second, those of you who are at home. Even those of you here are dealing with that. Do you like the angel? The angel of Bethesda from Central Park. Okay. Bethesda, yeah. The angel Bethesda, it's called the angel of the waters or something, I think is the name that they gave it. Okay. Let me do slideshow. Let's see if I can get it to work this time. Okay, so I'm hoping that, no, maybe I actually have to do the screen share yet from the, yeah, share. Okay. So again, we're gonna hopefully finish off this review and within the first few bits of this of tonight, and then we'll go on to continue with the text. So let's go to the few quotes that Geshe Rabten has in his book about the 11 virtues. And this is just to give us a taste for what these are all about. Like I said, I won't spend as much time going through them again since we did spend quite a bit of time previously. In this chapter, the chapter that he had on these wholesome, virtuous mental factors, he says, we shall consider the 11 positive qualities of the mind that cause the omnipresent object ascertaining and variable mental factors. We haven't talked about the variable ones yet. That's at the tail end of our text. To likewise take on a wholesome aspect and as a result produce peace and well-being for oneself and others. So this is one of the flavors or one of the realities of these virtuous ones versus ones that we're going to be discussing later that are non-virtuous, that are included in what we would call the afflictions, is that whenever one of those is present, they flavor the whole mind that way. So if we have a virtuous mental factor present, then the entire mind takes on a virtuous tone. And if we have a non-virtuous mind present, then the entire mind takes on a non-virtuous tone. So this is kind of what flavors the mind in terms of what produces either happiness and well-being for ourselves and others, or what produces more suffering and dissatisfaction. So through constantly striving to cultivate them, meaning the virtuous mental factors, they will become firmly rooted in the mind, thus naturally counteracting the negative mental factors and leading one to a liberating vision of reality. So this is just Geshe Rabten's brief introduction to these that show that there's great importance in knowing these minds because they help us to cultivate more positive energy that produces greater positive karma, produces results then that are in the nature of happiness and well-being, and then eventually liberation and enlightenment. So these are the 11 factors. Again, I don't want to spend too much time going through them all. Faith in Buddhism, of course, is not blind faith. It has the aspect of clarity, conviction, or a wish to attain an aspiration with respect to things that exist, the possession of qualities, or various powers. And so, I always emphasize that with faith in Buddhism, it's one that is grounded in reason, grounded in our experience. It's not something that, again, is blind or simply believing in things because we have some faith in the person who says those things, such as the Buddha and so on. So the next two, shame and embarrassment, these are the terms that are generally used. We might replace them with words that are perhaps a bit more evocative of what they really are about. The first one being self-respect rather than shame, and then embarrassment we could replace with consideration for others. These are two factors that keep us from engaging in unwholesome behavior. When we have some self-respect, some desire to maintain the principles that we want to live by, because we ascribe to Buddhist practice and what have you. And then consideration for others, which here is called embarrassment, means that we also want to think about the effect that our negative actions will have on others around us, particularly those who are teaching us to practice in this way, that it will have a detrimental impact on our teachers, on Buddhism in general, and what have you. So there may be a time when in our lives where these two fail to be as important, in our discipline and our refraining from negative actions, but nonetheless, they're very often right at the beginning of our practice. And we really have to kind of hold true to the principles that we're trying to abide by, and that, of course, continues throughout our path. But then this concern for what others might, what might befall others on the basis of our own misbehavior. The next three, non-attachment, non-hatred, and non-ignorance. So we're going to be looking at these three opposites to these, attachment, and then anger or hatred, and then ignorance very shortly. Those will be in the afflictions. These are the opposing states of those. So when these are present, that means that we are no longer having a mind of attachment, that we have the virtuous mind that is free of that. We have the mind that is free of hatred, and we have the mind that is without the ignorance. Ignorance can be of a couple of varieties, as we're going to see. But anyway, all three of these are an absence of those. So the way they're described in the text is non-attachment is an emergence from and non-desire for cyclic existence and the articles of cyclic existence. So all the things that we are normally attached to, that we have strong desire and craving for, this is an avoidance of that type of mindset, an emergence from that. For non-hatred, it's a factor that in observing either harmful sentient beings, our own sufferings, or the sources of those sufferings, conquers the generation of hatred. It is an absence of the intent to harm. So we also see non-harmfulness on the list. That's number 11. We'll talk about that shortly, but this is also in the nature of having an avoidance of harm that is rooted in our not generating hatred towards the things that normally would be stimulating our anger, our frustration, and so on. Non-ignorance is described as a knowledge of individual analysis that can serve as an antidote to ignorance. So anyway, this is kind of in the nature of wisdom, this last one we could say. But remember how we used the term wisdom earlier, intelligence is one of the object determining. So this is a specific form of wisdom when we are cultivating that virtuous state that knows things more clearly as they are, that has that knowledge. The next two, effort and pliancy, come into play a lot in terms of developing concentration, but effort is required for a lot of our endeavors in the Buddhist path. Effort is described as a mental delight in virtue. It has the function of fulfilling and accomplishing virtues. And of course, laziness is what is discordant with effort. We'll get to laziness and is part of the secondary or proximate afflictions, which we'll get to later on in this course. But effort is highlighted as what's absolutely essential for us to attain single-pointed concentration, or single-pointed concentration, calm abiding. Pliancy is what arises on the basis of our effort. And pliancy is the suppleness and serviceability of the mind and body. But here we're talking about the mind. Pliancy is described as a serviceability of mind and body such that the mind can be set on a virtuous object of observation as long as one likes. It has the function of removing all obstructions. So through our concerted effort in developing mental single-pointed mind, through our concentration, meditative practices, we are able to eventually attain this state that's known as calm abiding, or shine. Shamatha is the Sanskrit term for that. It entails this arisal of what we call pliancy. And pliancy is where then the mind and body are completely serviceable so that you can meditate as long as you wish on any object that you wish to focus upon, any virtuous object, and not be distracted and be able to penetrate deeply into the truth of those. So this is a very important skill to develop at some point. Mostly here, as I said, because it's a mental factor, we're talking about the pliancy of the mind, the suppleness of the mind. Whoops, sorry. Conscientiousness is another factor that plays a prominent role in terms of keeping our mind from wandering and doing what we need to do. Conscientiousness keeps the mind from contaminations and causes the achievement of virtue. while abiding in effort. It keeps the mind from coming under the influence of the affliction. So we need great conscientiousness, again, to counteract the afflictions that we'll be discussing later tonight. Equanimity is here talking about a particular ability of the mind to dwell in a state of balance where you're no longer having any disturbance. So this is described in our text as an evenness of mind, a dwelling in a neutral state, and a spontaneous abiding discordant with the afflictions. So when we have equanimity in the mind, because equanimity is a term we use in a number of different ways in Buddhism, this is talking about the ability for the mind to simply be in that place of not being disturbed, to have that balanced state of mind that arises primarily through our concentration. Some of us, even without having developed calm abiding, will experience some level of equanimity in our meditation, where the afflictions don't so easily arise because we're in a more focused state. So this is something that does occur as we heighten our concentration, that the afflictions don't tend to arise because of that state of equanimity, but nonetheless, they still are there in a dormant state. So that's why we have to do the deeper work of generating the wisdom of emptiness and so on. But equanimity is an important factor on our path as well. Non-harmfulness is essentially equivalent to compassion. It's described as a compassionate attitude included as part of non-hatred. So what we saw earlier in non-hatred as the absence of a wish to harm others and so on the basis of having moved away from our normal path of hatred towards sentient beings who harm us, sufferings we experience, and so on. But here, this is a kind of the compassion that arises. It's part of non-hatred, which is patience devoid of intention to injure. So it's an ability to be patient and endure what's going on with no desire to harm, with only compassion arising. So if you had to include compassion in any of these, it would be included in number 11, but we could say it's also probably a factor within number 5, the non-hatred. So these are the 11 that are pointed to as kind of the main mental factors that are virtuous. So you can already see, I mean, things like loving kindness would probably also be included in number 5 and 11. There are a lot of things that we practice that might not be on this list, but this list is to highlight those that in the Buddhist survey of the mind are most important for us to focus upon in our Buddhist practice. So any questions on those in general? I realize I went through them rather quickly, but let's go on then to the next slide. I've got just a few more things about the virtuous mental factors, and I may not have actually shown these slides previously. I don't recall. Geshe Rabten, after going through all 11 of these, he says, however, since these 11 wholesome mental factors never occur simultaneously in any one primary state of mind, we may wonder at what times and in what combinations they do occur. Now, what's interesting is there is a book by, that's the one I've quoted from previously, Path to the Middle, by Khentsur Yeshe Topten, I think is his name. He says that all of these are present when we have the mind that's realizing emptiness directly, but it's kind of hard. These are all conceptual minds, you know, so how would you have a conceptual mind present when you have a non-conceptual wisdom realizing emptiness? But anyway, let's not go down another one of those pathways of trying to figure out these anomalies. But these virtuous mental factors obviously are, they do have different objects, right? You know, things that we're looking at and having a particular thought about. So it would make sense that their arisal wouldn't be simultaneous, as Geshe Rabten says. But so what he says is that we can classify 6 distinct occasions for their occurrence. So some of them do arise together, but we essentially see that first, at times of having belief, having some conviction in things, faith occurs. The first one that we saw on the list. At times of turning away from evil, and again, evil is, this is the translation that Stephen Batchelor did for this, we would say from negativity or negative deeds. Self-respect and consideration for others occurs. Those were the next two, shame and embarrassment, right? Self-respect and consideration for others, as I said, those are kind of a better way to word those. At times of engaging in virtue, non-attachment, or what he calls detachment, non-hatred, non-bewilderment, he uses the term rather than non-ignorance, and enthusiasm or effort occur. So whenever we're engaging in virtue, we have a lack of those 3 opposites, attachment, hatred, and ignorance, and then we have some enthusiasm, effort that is helping us to move in the direction of virtue, because recall that effort is a delight in virtue. At times of freeing oneself from attachment by worldly means, suppleness or pliancy occurs. So by this term, freeing oneself from attachment by worldly means, we mean engaging in the meditative practices that allow you to have a mundane sort of release of attachment. It's not super mundane yet. You haven't actually gotten rid of attachment, but you've allowed attachment to be dormant. You've made it non-manifest. So that's when pliancy occurs. There's no real room for these delusions, especially attachment, to arise, because the mind of pliancy would keep them from occurring. Doesn't mean that they're gone again, but it does mean that they won't occur so easily. At times of freeing oneself from attachment by non-worldly means, supramundane means, then conscientiousness and equanimity occur. And I'm not sure I get the full impact of all of that. I'm not sure that again, conscientiousness and equanimity would seem to occur at other times as well. But this is, again, I'm not sure where Geshe Rabten even got this from. It's not in our text. At times of benefiting others, nonviolence occurs. That makes sense, right? When we're engaging in trying to enact the welfare of others, benefit them, then we have a mind of compassion or nonviolence, non-harmfulness. So the only one I had any questions about are this one's at times of freeing oneself from attachment by non-worldly means. That would again mean generally by our supramundane means, which would be the wisdom realizing emptiness in a non-conceptual manner, that we would then have conscientiousness and equanimity occurring. To me, they seem to occur at times other than that as well. But maybe that's when they come to their culmination, we might say. I don't know. So that's the end of my review of the stuff I covered previously. I hope that did some of it justice, but any comments on those 3 sets of mental factors we've looked at? So now we're going to continue, and we're going to start from page 48. So I'm going to go off screen here with this, stop sharing this on the Zoom with the folks that are doing that, because we're going to do a discussion, kind of review the discussion of virtue and non-virtue that takes place on pages 48 through about 52. So this is kind of an interesting discussion because it does give us some ways of understanding virtue as being more than just these mental factors that we've looked at. And then, of course, when we get to non-virtue, we'll see some distinguishing characteristics in terms of those mental factors that are in the afflictions that are in that category, kind of how they can influence and which of those are non-virtuous and so on. We'll do some more discussion on that. So if everyone has page 48 in front of them, are there folks who don't have the text at all that need to share? Okay, if you could share with the person next to you. Yeah, Jorge, do you need one, or do we need an extra copy of the text? Amy's going to bring hers. So the qualm is raised on page 48 with regard to virtue. Are the 11 virtuous mental factors which have been explained here exhaustive? In other words, is this it? Is this all we're talking about in terms of what is virtue? And the answer, of course, is no. In general, virtues are taught to be of 5 types. The first is virtues by way of entity. So the 11 that we just explained in brief, faith and so forth, are specified as being virtues by way of entity, because they are generated in the entity of virtue from their mere establishment without relying on other factors such as motivation. Hence, here I have indicated the 11 principal virtues. So these 11 that we discuss, whenever they arise, they are virtuous in nature because they perform some activity of virtue. Again, faith would be increasing, our conviction and determination to practice this path. Shame and embarrassment or self-respect and consideration for others cause us to avoid negative actions and so on. Every one of those has a virtuous function that it plays. And by virtue of that, they are virtue by way of entity. Virtues by way of relation is the second category. These are the minds and mental factors that are concomitant by way of the 5 similarities with the 11. So as I mentioned earlier, when we have a virtuous mental factor arising, it flavors the whole mind to be virtuous. So the 5 that we talk about that were omnipresent, feeling, discrimination, contact, attention, and intention, all 5 of those would be flavored in a virtuous way when you have the mind of faith present, for example. So those would be also virtuous, but they're virtuous by way of relation. They're not virtuous in and of themselves. Our feeling is not virtuous. Feeling becomes virtuous when it is together with the virtuous mental factor of faith and so forth. Virtues by way of subsequent relation are imprints of virtue, which are, deposited on the mental continuum. This is the reality for everything that is occurring in our minds. This is how essentially karma works, is that all of what we generate in our minds, an imprint is created on our minds. And that imprint arises into the furtherance of virtuous states in the future, if it was virtuous, or the furtherance of non-virtuous states, if it was non-virtuous. So why we have anger arising in our minds is because we have the imprints of anger from having been angry before. And you might ask, well, but where did anger come from originally? Well, there's no original thing in Buddhism. Everything goes back without any beginning. So we've always had the imprints for anger. We've always had the imprints for compassion. We've always had the imprints for every possible state of mind. But those imprints become heavier or more prominent by virtue of what we do with our minds. So subsequent relation means that these have a relationship to the virtue that was created in the beginning, and subsequently arise in furtherance of virtue. But the imprints themselves we can call virtue because they have a virtuous flavor, and they will bring forth their result of the furtherance of a virtuous state of mind in the future. Virtues by way of motivation are, for instance, physical and verbal actions that are motivated by faith. So this is, we're mostly talking about mind here, right? And that's all that we talked about in terms of the 11 mental factors. They were all in the mind. Here is where those states of mind become the motivation for something we do with our bodies or our speech. So for example, non-harmfulness, they used faith, but if we use non-harmfulness as an example, then that would be what allows us to refrain from injuring other beings or stealing from them and so on. That could be a factor that would play a role in those, as well as avoiding negativities of speech. Virtues by way of ultimacy, meaning what we would call ultimate virtue, are explained to be emptinesses, thusnesses, because all obscurations will be purified if one meditates within observation of thusness or emptiness. Therefore, they are designated as virtues, but are not actual virtues. And we can't say that the object emptiness is virtuous. The mind meditating on emptiness is virtuous, and the mind realizing that is virtuous. But the object itself is not virtuous. It is a simple fact of things lacking inherent existence. And so in that way, it's the ultimate virtue, because when it's realized, then we have the ultimate virtuous state of mind that can be generated. That mind that is directly realizing emptiness and thereby removing the afflictions by the root and so on. So this is just one of the categories of virtue, of what is virtuous that is not in itself virtuous, but is rather virtue. It's not an actual virtue, but it's related to virtue because at the ultimate level of mind, that is what is being realized, is thusness or emptiness. So this term emptiness is sometimes called thusness. It's not that frequent that you see that term. Sometimes called suchness as well, sometimes called selflessness. So you'll see different terms for it. We'll be talking about that as we get into the afflictions. We already touched on it a little bit here and there, but that becomes more prominent when we look at the affliction of ignorance and also the view of the transitory collection, those two, where we are not realizing the emptiness of inherent existence of various phenomena. So those 5 are one way that the virtues are taught to be of 5 types. But then there's a second explanation at the bottom of page 48. When the virtues explained above are divided from the viewpoint of circumstances, there are the following, and this is 8 in total. So let's go to the next page and just go through those one by one. Virtue by way of attainment at birth is, for instance, the faith that arises through mere rebirth due to the imprints from past lives without depending on familiarization in this lifetime. So this is the fact that certainly, as I mentioned, when we've had strong imprints of virtuous states on our minds in previous lives, those come into our subsequent lives. So people can, from the very beginning, attained at birth, have strong faith arising or have strong compassion arising and so on. Yes, Bob?
Yeah, I mean, when I look at this in terms of circumstances, what it really seems to me is it seems to be saying how these virtues are always can. And so your category of virtuous mind that you have in terms of what caused it, to arrive at.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think I would say that's a good way to put it as well. On the occasions when these occur, um, you know, or have when they become, yeah, I guess when they're formulated, as well as perhaps when they have ripened. Because in this case, you have both the imprints of virtue that have ripened, as well as the virtuous states that are subsequent to them. So, but yeah, primarily in terms of when they are developed. So the second one, virtue by way of application, is, for instance, the generation of the wish to attain Buddhahood in dependence on the four conditions. These conditions being: 1, relying on a virtuous spiritual guide; 2, listening to the excellent doctrine; 3, properly taking such to mind; and 4, practicing doctrines that are concordant with the attainment of nirvana. So this is kind of how we gain virtue through applying the teachings in our lives, is through relying upon someone who plays that role for us as the guide, listening to their doctrine that they teach, taking it to mind, and then practicing in that way. So it makes sense, again, that this is how virtue would be generated on that basis. Virtue by way of activity directed in front is, for instance, actions of making prostrations and making offerings within observation of the special field of accumulation. So it doesn't just mean, when you're here in the Gompo with these holy objects arranged. It can be anytime you are visualizing or thinking about holy beings and making any form of homage or offerings and so on to them. This is a role that the holy beings play for us, is that they are there as a support for our development of these qualities and merit and so on. That's why we often call them the merit field. They're a field in which all of that is grown, all of that can be developed. And that's because they have such great qualities. Again, the person who we refer to as our Lama or our Guru is said to be the heaviest object for us, and making offerings and so on in relation to them is said to be the strongest by virtue of them being heavy with qualities, which is a literal translation of Guru. Virtue by way of benefiting is, for instance, actions such as ripening sentient beings by way of the four means of gathering disciples. So there is a footnote on these. These four are usually taught at the very end, almost the tail end of every Lam Rim text. Sometimes they're inserted before you get to the deeper discussion of the perfections of concentration and wisdom. But these four means of gathering disciples are one of the Bodhisattva's activities. Don't interpret these, though, as like proselytizing. I don't think that this is quite what we mean, gathering disciples, like we're going to go out and, try to make everybody Buddhist and become our disciples or something. These four are: 1, giving dharma and material necessities to disciples. Material necessities are emphasized very frequently because giving dharma is often emphasized in the remaining ones, at least in the next two. But we certainly, should try to be as generous as we can with others, recalling that this is the first of the 6 perfections of the Bodhisattva, is to practice generosity. The second one is speaking pleasantly. Of course, there are times when perhaps we have to speak in ways that are harsher, but because we have to get a message across that requires that. But in general, we want to speak to people in a pleasant tone, to be very inviting to them, to not, put up barriers to them finding the Dharma. Again, I mentioned earlier that these aren't about proselytizing, and that's because in essence, we would say that beings either don't or do have the karma to receive these teachings. And if they have the karma to receive these teachings, then they'll be very receptive, and that's fine. And if they don't, well, then there's no point in trying to, spoon feed or force feed any of this down somebody's throat. People will react one way or the other. So if we speak pleasantly, at least there's no barriers to the Dharma. People won't be turned off by, oh God, this is what Buddhism's about, because they'll make an assessment on the basis of who's talking to them. And these apply to any of us. It doesn't apply just to someone who's in a role as a teacher, because we're all teaching others by virtue of our example and how we are in the world. So we should speak pleasantly to others as much as possible. The third point is to apply the meaning by helping them to put into practice the teachings that you have given. So this is important, especially if you do have people who are relying upon you to perform that task. But those people who are in our lives, who we share the teachings with here and there, it's good for us to have that attention, to try to help them to apply them in their lives correctly, to put them into practice. And then the fourth one is perhaps the most important in my mind, is acting in accord. We shouldn't be not practicing what we preach or teach, right? If we are saying one thing to certain people and then doing something that's completely opposite, that's hypocrisy. That's not really fulfilling what the teachings are there for. To tout all the good qualities of this incredible medicine of the Dharma and then never take it yourself would be really ridiculous. So as much as possible, we have to do that. Admittedly, we don't have the ability to apply all of the Dharma within our lives, but we do the best that we can and continue on that development. So this fourth one doesn't mean that all the bodhisattvas should be perfect. All the people who are practicing this path should be perfect in their practice of the Dharma, but they should be making a concerted effort to apply these teachings in their lives. And so all four of those do play an important role in terms of helping people to have some faith, some conviction in the Dharma, to be interested in the Dharma, and then if they don't have any other obstacles, to be able to follow it through guidance and concern on the part of those of us aspiring to do those deeds. So these are taught, as I said, usually as part of the Bodhisattva path and the great scope of the Lam Rim. And there's not a whole lot more said about them, but I think Lama Zopa has applied them to how we should run centers, that this is part of how we should be practicing the Dharma in terms of a center, that we should be practicing generosity right from the beginning, helping others. It's one reason why we have the Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archive books here, is we can very easily hand something to people. People like to receive things. This is the world that we live in. That's part of helping people to feel welcome and to feel that they belong and so on. So these are some things to take into consideration in terms of how we run the Dharma Center, how we live our lives, our own practice of the Dharma as well. So the point that was being made here in number 4 was that this is how we generate the virtue of benefiting other sentient beings. By way of doing that, we create virtue. The 5th one, we have virtue, that's by way of bearing. I don't know if this term bearing, I think there was another translation for this in the other translation of this book, which I don't know if everyone knows about that, but there is a Kindle book that is available that has a translation by, I can't remember who translated this one. I'd have to go back to the earlier part of the book. Maybe I'll do that later. This one was called Virtuous by Things That Produce Merit. In this. But anyway, let's look at what he says here. For instance, special wholesome actions which act as the means for attaining high status and definite goodness. So high status is the shorthand for attaining a good rebirth. Definite goodness or certain goodness is shorthand for liberation and enlightenment. So high status is simply referring to any of the actions, any of the means, any things that we engage in that produce the merit that help us to have a good rebirth, that help us to assure, that we will gain a good rebirth in the future. So this would be all of our virtuous actions that are complete and so on, that have that potential. Then definite goodness or certain goodness, why these are called certain goodness is that there's no certainty to the goodness of a higher rebirth, right? Because it will end and it can't be relied upon completely. Liberation and enlightenment can be relied upon completely because they are certain to continue. If you gain liberation, you never degenerate from liberation. You never have an existence where you aren't liberated after that. And if you attain enlightenment, then you are enlightened forever. So that's why those are called definite goodness. So this would be any of the actions that we engage in that produce merit that is directed towards that goal of attaining definite goodness, liberation, or enlightenment. Virtue by way of acting as an antidote is, for instance, virtuous actions that possess the special power to directly destroy the objects of abandonment and the discordant class. So by antidote, we mean anything that we generate that is opposing all of those negative states. So the objects of abandonment are our afflictions, the afflictive obscurations, as well as the knowledge obscurations. And the discordant class, of course, are those states of mind that keep us bound in samsara, that keep us from achieving liberation and enlightenment. So this is any of the antidotal acts or states of mind that we engage in that would be helping us to destroy any of the opposing forces. Again, all of these opposing forces are within our own minds, our own obscurations that are our afflictions, our knowledge obscurations, which are the imprints of ignorance that give rise to dualistic appearance and so on. All of these things, anytime we're engaging in antidoting them, this is creating virtue. Virtue by way of pacification is explained to be, for instance, true cessations, just as it is said in a stanza of Homage to the Dharma. I think this is the same stanza that we use frequently in the opening prayers. If you go back to the prayer book, I might have set it aside, but it's on about 75, I think, where it says, on 74, the purity that frees one from attachment, the virtue that frees one from the lower realms, the one path, the sublime pure reality, to the Dharma that pacifies, I prostrate. I think this is very, very similar, if not identical. The first two lines certainly are, unique, ultimate, supreme. That's the same as one path, the sublime pure reality, to the Dharma that pacifies, I prostrate. So this is, when we talk about Dharma, we are essentially talking about the true paths and the true cessations. The true paths are everything that we engage in that eventually results in the path that realizes emptiness directly, that has that non-conceptual realization of emptiness. By virtue of that, you attain what's called a true cessation, which is what will actually cease and eliminate a portion of the obscurations. So the true cessations themselves are a part of what we could call this pacification. The pacification occurs by way of the true paths that are generated in our minds, and then is accompanied by the true cessations, which is the removal, so that they do not occur again, of any of the levels of the obscurations. So this is what we really mean by Dharma. We use Dharma in a very broad, or much more general way to refer to everything that we're learning here. But essentially, we're talking about the true paths and the true cessations that we need to generate in our own minds. That will be the end result of all the practice that we engage in, are those direct realizations of emptiness that cause us to have those eliminations of the obscurations in our own minds. And then finally, number 8, virtue by way of concordant cause is, for example, the 5 clairvoyances and the 10 powers that arise through the force of attaining true cessations. So these are things that come along as a kind of a concordant to that cause, but we would call them, virtue that arises on the basis of the true cessations that we have in our minds. The 5 clairvoyances we've discussed before. I don't know if I want to go into all of those again. We discussed them in the course on the chapter 4 of the ornament. And we also talked briefly on the 10 powers, which are on the footnote on the next page. These 10 powers are actually attained in their full state, in the state of Buddhahood. I don't know that I think they're an exclusive quality of a Buddha, as opposed to one that is attained by a bodhisattva, whereas the 5 clairvoyances can even be attained prior to entering the path by someone who attains concentration. But nonetheless, they have a special quality when they are supermundane, when they're together with the true cessation. So then the very last sentence of this section says, these virtues explained above are either actual or designated. Just like we saw in the previous explanation, there were some that were designated that weren't actual, and that was the virtue of thusness, or the ultimate virtue. I'm not going to go back and try to pick apart which ones are which. I think I'll leave that up to you. But so any questions on this whole categorization? Yeah, Bob?
Yeah, when I look at this list, you ask yourself why.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
List of all different ways.
Sure, exactly. Because we're going to see the exact same thing in regard to non-virtue. We're going to have 2 identical listings. The first is what is non-virtue by, in and of itself, in the various categorizations that are general, and then what are the means of those non-virtues arising. So that we become more aware of all of the facets and features of these 2 different states of mind that are really the key to determining whether we have happiness and well-being in our lives, as well as something that transcends psychic existence. So. Yeah.
I want to go out and bring first. This list tells you many things.
Yeah.
For example, create an antidote. Work on achieving that. Some of them I think are very high.
Sure.
Like a fantasy,
Right.
like
Yeah.
But many of the other things are actually very practical.
Yeah.
If you wanted to say, how do I go about it? First, take the mind, first look at the list, work on it.
Definitely. So any other comments? Thanks, Bob. Any other comments on? Let's move on then to, as I said, there will be a similar categorization now in the discussion of non-virtues. So the very first one, it says again, they're taught to be of 5 types. And first is non-virtues by way of entity. You okay, Rowena? Getting down? We'll help you get up if you need. Okay. So it says there first, non-virtues by way of entity. So you'll notice that these are pretty much identical, these 5 categories, right, is what we just saw for virtue. We saw entity, relation, subsequent relation, motivation, and ultimacy. So the very first one, non-virtues by way of entity, are mostly the root afflictions and the secondary afflictions. So you may wonder, why does it say mostly? We have this tendency, whenever we think of the word affliction or delusion or negative state, we think that this is, by its very nature, non-virtuous. But there are a few, and there are only a few, mental factors that are within this list that we're going to go through of the afflictions that actually are not in and of themselves non-virtuous, meaning that they can arise accompanied by a virtuous state of mind, that they don't have a non-virtuous flavor by their very entity. And now what are those two? I'll be mentioning this again as we go through them, but I mentioned them briefly earlier. One is the ignorance that is not realizing things as they are in terms of thinking things have an inherent self, thinking things have an inherent identity. If that was a non-virtuous state of mind by entity, we would never be able to create much virtue, because that is a state of mind that we have almost all the time. There are very rare instances where that won't be present. But usually we have some level of grasping at things as having an inherent existence. Even when we're engaging in virtue, we have that. We think that the Buddhas inherently exist. We think we inherently exist. We think the act of prostrating or offering or whatever inherently exists. So that state of mind, that ignorance, that is a very subtle form of ignorance, isn't in and of itself in the entity of non-virtue. Whereas something like anger, and we're talking about it as the delusion, the way it's described, is always going to be non-virtuous. When it arises with the intention to harm others and so on, that will be a non-virtuous state of mind by way of its own entity. The other one, besides the ignorance that is adhering to a self of persons or phenomena, that is part of this that's not in the category of being non-virtuous by way of entity, is what we call the view of the transitory collection, which is simply a subset of the first one I just mentioned, the ignorance that is adhering to a self. But it's a view that is specifically looking at this collection of stuff here, the person that is imputed on this, and holding that person to be inherently existent. So this is like our own personal view of inherent existence with relation to our own self, and that self as an owner of various things. So it's often called the view of the transitory collection in relation to I and mine. It's the I that we feel so strongly exists in this collection of stuff that we think is inherently here, and then that possessor of things that is the mine. So we'll be discussing both of those when we get into the afflictions. But know that, once more, they aren't non-virtuous by entity, or we would be having very little occasion for being able to get any sort of virtue in our mind. So they are kind of a subtle misunderstanding of how we exist or how things exist that flavor all of our actions, or a good part of our actions, until we have some wisdom we can generate that is an antidote to those. And we can create virtue with that mind of ignorance and that view of the transitory collection, and we can create non-virtue with regard to them. But the goal, of course, in all of our Buddhist path is to be free of both of those. You know, to have them out of our mind, and virtue can still be upheld even within the wisdom that realizes selflessness and emptiness. Whereas non-virtue has no support, has no platform once we remove those. So I'll talk about these more, but just that's why it says by way of entity are mostly the root afflictions and the secondary afflictions. You know, so not all of them are going to be by way of entity. Most of them will be. And so I will again reiterate that when we get into the afflictions. Any questions on that though before we go on? All right, so then let's look at the second category. Non-virtues by way of relation are very similar to what we saw for virtues by way of relation, the minds and mental factors that are concomitant with those afflictions. So when you have anger present in your mind, your discrimination is non-virtuous. Your contact is non-virtuous. Your Aspiration is non-virtuous. All the things that we talked about previously that were the 5 object ascertaining and the 5 omnipresent, those would be flavored in a non-virtuous way because you have the mind of anger present. Non-virtues by way of subsequent relation are the imprints of non-virtue. As I mentioned previously, you have imprints of both virtue and non-virtue in the mind. And so those give rise to future states of mind that are in accord with that. So here we're talking about those being non-virtue. Non-virtues by way of motivation are the physical and verbal actions motivated by those afflictions. So if we have anger in our mind and we yell at somebody, use harsh words and demeaning words to them, then we have a verbal action that has occurred by the motivation of anger. And so that would be non-virtue as well. Non-virtues by way of ultimacy. It's kind of weird to talk about ultimate non-virtue. What does that look like? They are phenomena phenomena included within cyclic existence. So this might sound like a bit of a generalization. He does go on to explain, since these phenomena of cyclic existence are the sources from which superiors generate despondency or renunciation, they are called non-virtues by way of ultimacy. Nonetheless, it is not definite that everything included in cyclic existence is an actual non-virtue. So we're just kind of labeling all of what we turn away from, which we call samsara, cyclic existence, and we turn towards liberation. This is the mind of renunciation that is generated on the basis of the middle scope, having been informed by the small scope, that when we get to the end result of this, we generate that mind that is intent upon emerging from that cycle of existence. It's the term in Tibetan is defined as definite emergence. That we no longer want to be engaged in any of samsara and want to be completely apart from it. Now, of course, Buddhas don't have the wish to completely remove themselves from samsara, but they still have the wish to be free of samsara. They will still engage in samsara as a Buddha.
I'm confused now because it sounds like you're talking about a virtue.
But this is the phenomenon that we're turning away from. So it's saying here, what we call non-virtues by way of ultimacy are those things that superiors generate despondency towards, or renunciation towards. So eventually we have to get to the point where we recognize that all the pleasures of samsara, as wonderful as they might be, and as enjoyable as they might be, are unsatisfactory. Even what we are able to attain in terms of some level of mundane virtue is not in the end satisfactory, because it never leads us completely out of samsara, never helps us to attain either liberation or enlightenment. So those actions can be relied upon, and they are part of the practice of the Dharma. But nonetheless, and because as it says there, it is not definite that everything included in cyclic existence is an actual non-virtue. But nonetheless, we do have to generate at some point in our path the mind that turns away from all of that. And I know this is a really hard concept. I was teaching in Scotland the last weekend I was on my time in Europe. There was one woman in the group who was really intent upon saying that she just didn't like these terms of like seeing samsara as unsatisfactory, or in the state of dukkha, or whatever, all these terms that we use when we talk about what we're turning away from. But this is the whole point, is we have to get to a place where we want to turn away from all of that. There's a wonderful quote, I don't have it with me tonight, from Jitsun Tenzin Palmo, who many of you know, the woman who has spent all these years meditating. There's a book about her called Cave in the Snow. Anyway, she's an amazing practitioner, but she talks about how this is a really hard place to get to turn away from samsara, to turn away from this type of non-virtue, this ultimate non-virtue. She said most of us, don't want to really think that we're in a prison cell. We just want to make the prison cell look a little nicer, decorate it a little bit better, have it be a little more pleasant. So we have to begin to, at some point, see that we are in a prison cell, that we're in an unsatisfactory state. So this is what we mean by non-virtues by way of ultimacy. It's all the phenomena included within cyclic existence that we eventually have to turn away from and turn towards liberation and enlightenment. So any question on those 5? There's a lot of, you do have to wrestle with these ideas, I think. This isn't an easy one. This would be a good thing to meditate on further and further, just to kind of get our own clarity about what it is that we really do need to turn away from. Rinpoche has this wonderful course that I have taught here before. It's part of the Living in the Past series. It's called The Happiness of Dharma. which is the reality that as we practice Dharma, we do have, through the force of our virtue, a greater happiness and well-being that is still within samsara. It's still mundane, but it's pointing in the right direction. It's not pointing in the way of continuing to further our going from life to life and so on. So that's why we can say there still are things within samsara, within cyclic existence, that are not in the nature of non-virtue. But they still will not be something we can ultimately rely upon, because there's still something wrong with them ultimately. They don't take us to that state of, as we said earlier, certain goodness or definite goodness. Yeah, Lorda. Uh-huh. Right. Right. So I've been forgetting to repeat what has been shared in the room with the folks online. I'm sorry about that. But Lourdes was just bringing up the question that she had from reading a passage from Lama Yeshe about where he denies at one point that there is the Atman or the soul, but then later on talks about mental continuity, mental continuum, and the idea that karma and so on carries forward with that. I mean, if there was anything in Buddhism that we would make equivalent to the soul, it would be our consciousness, especially the very subtle consciousness that's sort of the thread that goes through all of our existences. And we have grosser levels of awareness that manifest around that. For example, if I had a dog mind in this life versus a human mind, it would be very different, right? My consciousnesses would be heightened in some ways that they aren't in this, and they would be lessened in ways that they, different than what this life is. So we have grosser levels of awareness that all form around a particular existence, but then there's always a thread of awareness that goes through all of our lives. But we wouldn't identify that as a soul. It's simply the continuity of consciousness. And by soul, I think what he's talking about when he refutes a soul or an Atman is a sense of something that is permanent, eternal and unchanging, that is also unitary and is also completely independent of the mind and body. So it would have to be different than the mind and body. And that was actually how I got a sense of what soul was from my Roman Catholic upbringing. I never was completely clear on what it was to have a soul. But it seemed to be some phenomenon that was completely apart from this existence of my mind and body, but yet was here with me in some way. But it's something that could be isolated in that way that we could say is the essence of who we are. And the Buddha says no such thing exists. That there is a continuity of awareness, and there is a physical form that we take on the basis of our karma, and all of our seeds of karma and all of our imprints, virtuous, non-virtuous, and so on, go together with that mind. But that mind isn't really a soul. So that's the distinction that's made in Buddhism. But did you want to share something?
Yeah, I think a soul would almost like my personality. Like
Some sort of essence of who you are. Yeah.
Who I am.
Yeah.
There's some essence, some natural personality. Like, whereas the Buddhist view, it's like our personality, our consciousness, constantly changes all the time.
Right.
There's no fixed point in our life. Everything's fixed versus even
Right.
present life. So everything
Yeah.
is
So Bob was just saying that, again, everything is constantly changing, that there's no sort of eternal essence of who we are that is kind of our personality or something that we carry forward from life to life. There's always a new construct on the basis of that consciousness together with another existence. This in and of itself speaks to the lack of at least that type of person. But of course, when we get into the variations of what the Buddha refuted, this is a coarser view of what the Buddha is refuting. At the very subtlest level is the view that there's anything within this collection of stuff that is identifiable as the self, that is the person in all ways, in the way that we think of the person as having that kind of intrinsic identity. So this already gives us some loosening up of that sense of self by showing that it changes from life to life. Even though there is a continuity of awareness, it's not that Don was somebody else in the prior life, that Don is the sort of constant that runs through all this. Don is just what's happening on the basis of the mental consciousness coming into this life being informed by karma, the whole personality that gets generated around that. When that ceases, then the consciousness goes on to another life, and a whole new set of identification, traits, characteristics, and so on will be formulated on the basis of that being. But there is a continuity of awareness that is what allows for the propulsion from life to life of that karma, for that karma to be yours to experience. Otherwise, yeah, I would create all this karma on this life and it would die when Don dies, and that would be the end of Don's karma. And the new person would have no karma that they start with and would create their own karma. But rather there is the imprints from all of that that go through. But again, the Buddha wouldn't identify that mind then as a soul on that basis. And that does become, again, when you get down to the subtlest levels of understanding how the self exists, it does become a bit problematic to posit exactly how all this happens. But I don't know. That's another discussion, perhaps. I don't know that I want to go there tonight. Yeah, Amy? Okay.
To the non-virtues of, by way of ultimacy, shortly after I moved here, I talked to you and I said, I get that this is samsara, but this samsara is like so much better than the last samsara before I moved here. And you explained it really in a way that really made it sound like that's great that the samsara is better and that's a good thing, but it's still samsara. Could you do that one more time?
So what Amy was asking me to do was to talk about how we can have, some improvement in samsara, but we have to still see it as samsara. But it's interesting because if we look at the Lam Rim, this is how it's built, right? The very first level of our practice is to say, we need to keep having a good samsara, relatively. Why? Because we need to keep having the opportunities that we're having right now. If we do get an animal rebirth in our next existence, it's like, it's, what's the game? Chutes and ladders. It's like the chute, that kind of takes us back down. We're trying to get up the ladder, and then all of a sudden, you go down and you're way at the beginning of the game again. So the point is that it's good to have good conditions in samsara, good conditions for practice. But as we'll see, when you generate that intention to begin with, but then you generate much deeper and stronger intentions as you go through the rest of the Lam Rim. And you can even get to the point where you would be happy to take rebirth in these lower realms and in horrible states of samsara and what have you, because you see it as if you have the awareness and the ability, as incredible boon to your practice if you're able to use it in that way. So it's not that we should become totally attached to samsara always being nice and frilly and delightful and delicious, but rather that we should, acknowledge that what we do have, let's make sure we use it well. And when we don't have it, let's make sure we use that well too. So once you get to the great scope and that greater motivation, then you're willing to work with whatever. If, Santa Fe goes to hell and everything becomes horrible and, we're all dealing with, all kinds of adverse conditions, and we're able to practice with that, as well as the convenience, the good fortune and everything that most of us in the room are experiencing right now. So we just have to have, again, that understanding that that's not a final answer. That's why that term, high status indefinite goodness, is really quite relevant. There's nothing definite about samsara because things change like that. And look at how people who, have good fortune, and then all of a sudden something happens and they plummet and no longer are experiencing any of that due to bad health or due to, whatever. Fires. Look at the fires. I mean, the fires, that's an excellent example. Quite unfortunate, but it shows how fragile it all is. You can be one day basking in having amazing mansion and estate and what have you, and then the next day it's gone down to the ground. Okay, I hope that helped. I don't know if that's how I explained it last time. I don't recall. So then we see, again, that we have non-virtue. It says there, well, also it appears that in regard to the non-virtues explained above, there are many distinctions to be made between actual and designated and regarding their divisions and functions. So again, I'm not going to go into all of that. If you want to study non-virtue extensively, there's texts like the Abhidharma Kosha and all that goes into a lot of that. This is just to kind of move us as a segue between what we just talked about and most of what we're going to be talking about going forward, which are the afflictive states, most of which are non-virtue. Now we're looking at the circumstances, and there are 7 circumstances, whereas there was 8 with virtue. That's because 8, we had these sort of concordant causes. Now again, you don't have pacification either, but you have something that kind of acts in an opposing manner similarly. But let's look at these. They're on page 51 then. Non-virtue by way of attainment at birth is just like we saw with virtue, to have something that you come into this life with in terms of imprints. Here, the example that's being given is instinctively engaging in murder through mere rebirth due to the imprints from past lives. Of course, I guess murder, killing might be a better way to put it, but you can see even that many young children are born from a very early age. They'll exhibit that type of behavior of having no qualms about killing bugs or killing small creatures. And you'll have some people who are born, and develop and are always protecting life. So you see that, again, it's the same type of idea that there is an attainment at birth that influences what we do, and then we continue to further that to some degree by continuing to engage in either negative or positive actions. So and then he goes on to say, at the time of debating on words such as these, the action of killing, for instance, is posited as a non-virtue. If the engagement in killing is accepted to be a non-virtue, then debate ensues. And so this is just a real technical point, and I couldn't find a full explanation of it, but it's possible it's one of two things. One is to say, again, that killing is an act that becomes non-virtuous by way of the mental factor that is together with it. So we would call it a non-virtuous action, but that's when it is together with a non-virtuous mental factor. You can have, and there is certainly the one instance in the life of the previous lives of the Buddha, where there was a killing on the basis of compassion, where he took the life of the ship captain. We always use it as that's the only example. So it's kind of nice that it's the only example, because it points to the rarity of that being able to be something that you engage in, that you would actually be able to make it into a virtuous action when you kill with compassion.
I think there's some debate about whether that's actually a virtuous action. He still had to go and experience hell because of the act of killing being a non-virtuous action, although it was done with the motivation
right.
that was virtuous.
But I think that's, yeah.
But the act of killing is still seen, even in some explanations.
Yes, yeah. Yes, what Rachel's pointing out is that the act of killing was still, in some explanations of it, seen to be non-virtue, whereas the state of mind that the Buddha had in that bodhisattva life as the ship captain seemed to be virtuous. And they say it even in shorten the amount of time that the Buddha had to spend on the path to become enlightened, because it propelled him further than his not having engaged in that action. But yeah, I mean, they do say that the one explanation had the Buddha descended into a state of hell, but immediately popped back out. There was not even a second spent in hell.
So he developed compassion in hell, you still have to do it.
Yeah. Well, but I always got the impression that it was because of the strength of the virtuous action of his killing with compassion. But don't take this as license to kill with compassion. I mean, this isn't how you should understand this at all. Okay, so the story, Lourdes is asking about the story because she's not understanding how you could kill with compassion. So the story is that there was, he was reborn as a captain of a ship that was a merchant ship that was on its way back from having gotten all of these amazing goods. And there were 500 merchants on board the ship. And he, through his clairvoyance, because he was a highly developed bodhisattva, was able to discern that one of these merchants was going to take the lives of all the other merchants and take the goods for himself. And so on the basis of compassion for all the 499 merchants who would have been killed, as well as the compassion for the person who was going to engage in that killing, he took the life of that person, took that karma on himself with that intention that he would take on the karma of killing a being, knowing that he would not, there would be a interference to that being engaging in that heavy of a negativity and all those other beings being harmed. So that was how he killed with compassion. But he had to, had to have a very high power of intelligence and wisdom to know that that was the case, and to know that that would be an effective means of interfering with that. So it's not something we can take license to do, like if we have an animal that we think is suffering and we just feel a very compassionate motivation, think there's no problem in taking its life because it's suffering. I think we have to have a bit more than that going on.
Maybe we'll understand it better when we do this.
Hopefully. Yeah, Jerry?
Could he believe that he was in fact saving only
definitely. That was part of, what you're bringing up, Jerry, was it definitely, he was trying to avoid, well, I wouldn't say primarily, both the person who is taking all that, because the killing of 499 people is a very heavy karma. Killing of one person is a very heavy karma, you know. Yeah. So he was doing it with that extreme compassion. This is where, once more, in our world, it's very hard to find people who have compassion for both the perpetrator and the victim. I mean, if you're only doing it from compassion for the victims, then it wouldn't be a virtuous action, because your compassion isn't complete. Because you're having some holding them to be, it's almost like a mind of anger again, where you want to harm them to get them out of the way because they're going to kill the people you care about. Yeah, exactly. You don't have the balance or the equanimity. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So good and evil
Right.
aren't really a problem if you're the family.
So good and evil aren't really a problem. If you, I guess you would say, good and evil, you don't make a discernment, a discrimination on that basis. You still would want to stop the person who is engaging in what you see as bad and evil, and help them to engage in what we see as good, because we recognize that they will have greater welfare for themselves if they do that, and also others won't be harmed if they do that. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, just a brief comment. I mean, what it basically is the Bodhisattva is practicing universal compassion.
Right.
He's practicing compassion for everybody.
Yeah.
No distinction
Yeah.
between the person.
So Bob is just pointing out the day as a bodhisattva, you'd have universal compassion. So yeah, it's another way to put that. Yeah, Amy.
One more question. I don't remember seeing a distinction when it comes to killing people or killing all sentient beings. I don't ever see that. I mean,
or killing any sentient being. Do you mean?
Yes, I don't see. I don't see where there's any differentiation between killing a bird and killing a human.
So Amy's bringing up whether there's a differentiation in killing some other being versus a human being, and there is. In the teachings on karma and the Lam Rim, it is said to be a heavier act to take the life of a human being, not because a human being is inherently more valuable than a bird or a worm or whatever, but because as a human being, you have the potential to do so much more. That's why we talk about the preciousness of this human life. And so even those who are, on death row in the United States, in states where they still have, a capital punishment, we would say their lives are more valuable than the lives of animals, simply because they still have the ability and power to change their minds much more so than animals do. So the precious human rebirth, or the idea of human rebirth being a more valuable rebirth because of what you can do with it. We're not trying to set it up like a crown of creation sort of thing, that we're supposed to be and everyone else is subservient to human beings, but rather that we're looking at it purely from the point of view of what can be done with that life. And in general, humans can do more with their lives than animals. I'm not saying animals never engage in virtue, because we know that some of them do, but it's not something that can be influenced to the degree that you can with human beings in general. Always have to add that, because there are specific instances, certainly. Yeah. Okay. Let's, we got about 5 minutes. Let's see if we can get through this section. We have that continued then saying, if the engagement is accepted to be a non-virtue, then debate ensues. However, the classification of virtue and non-virtue here is not presented as debate material for today's new-minded beginners. Rather, it is presented as an essential branch for introducing the virtuous and non-virtuous objects of observation. Therefore, without clinging to mere words, you should turn your minds inwards and reflect upon how to put it into practice. So in other words, don't make this into too much that you're kind of splitting hairs over what is and isn't and all that, but recognize that it's advice for practice. So avoid, engaging in non-virtue as much as possible, which would include the act of killing. Anyway, that's probably enough said about that. Non-virtue by way of application is, for instance, misconduct of the three doors that arises in dependence on relying on a non-virtuous spiritual guide, listening to a counterfeit doctrine, familiarizing oneself with it through improper attention, and so forth. So you can go astray in the same way, as relying upon, a proper guide and all of that, you can have an improper guide that you depend upon and engage in activities applying yourself to what they're teaching. This is what happens certainly in a variety of places in the world where people are led astray by people who distort teachings to make them into something that supports non-virtue. Non-virtue by way of activity directed in front, we had something similar for virtue, is for instance offering a blood sacrifice to an image due to adhering to harmfulness as the doctrine of dependence on being deceived by a perverse spiritual guide. So if someone says it, in order to attain liberation, you have to make animal sacrifices before an altar or something. Well, then this would be you're following their advice, and then you're engaging in actions that are in accord with that, which would be non-virtuous. Non-virtue by way of harming is, for instance, actions harming sentient beings by way of our body, speech, and mind. I don't know that I need to say anything more about that. We had benefiting those that lead us to good rebirths and liberation and enlightenment, and here harming, that just simply produces more suffering for ourselves and others. Non-virtue by way of bearing is, for instance, projecting and completing actions which yield only suffering results. Projecting actions are the actions that take us into another rebirth. Completing are what fill out those rebirths. So every one of us, for our projecting action, we were projected into a human rebirth. The conditions of that human rebirth were flavored by our completing actions, which can be from a variety of lives that inform what you have in this life. The status that you're born into, the race you're born into, the gender you're born into, all of that is a fleshing out of this human existence that is a part of the projecting karma. And of course, the environment you're born into, the wealth or lack of wealth in the environment and in the people that you are in the house of those in your family and so on. All of that is part of the projecting karma. But getting you into a human rebirth is I'm sorry, I said completing. I meant completing. Projecting is what gets you into the rebirth. Completing is what fills in the whole picture. Trying to get this done quickly and stumbling over myself. Number 6, non-virtue by way of discordant class is, for instance, bad views that hinder the generation of uncontaminated paths. So anything that is discordant to our generation of wisdom or developing along the path, generating true paths and so on, would be discordant and thereby non-virtue. Non-virtue by way of interference is, for instance, bad views that interfere with all classes of virtue. So again, there are kind of parallels between what we saw for the virtue. And he goes on then to say, similarly in regard to the unspecified, because we have to say that there are 3 categories of phenomena in terms of these kind of results that we get from various actions or mind states. We had the virtuous, the non-virtuous, and then there are things that are called unspecified, which essentially are the states of mind where we're not generating anything virtuous and not generating anything non-virtuous. So they aren't specified in terms of they are more neutral states of mind. There are the divisions of the unspecified by way of entity and so forth, up to the unspecified by way of concordant cause. Moreover, there is much to be explained with regard to virtues and non-virtues, such as the aspect which appears to be virtue but is not, and the aspect which appears to be non-virtue but is not. However, I will not elaborate on them here, and that's why I'm not going to elaborate on them here. If you wish to understand them in detail, you should look at the knowledge text, the Abhidharma text. I mentioned Abhidharma Kosha, as well as there's the Abhidharma Samuccaya, which is the text by Asanga, the higher knowledge. At this point, I shall utter a few intermediary stanzas. Let's stop there, because this is actually where we segue into the next section to begin to look at the afflictions. So, any final questions or comments on what we looked at tonight? We're getting there. So this again was just a discussion of these two so that we have some clarity about these states of mind, what we call virtue and non-virtue. Non-virtue, as I said, we're going to be going into more detail as we look at the afflictions, those states of mind that are non-virtuous by entity, or again, at least do play some role in afflicting our minds. But we'll get into this in much more detail. Let's do our dedication prayers then. Any questions from either of the Marys? Mary Lutz, Mary Mulligan? got folks online. By the way, if any of you do want to be included in the classes, if you have to be, at home for some reason and you want to be able to come in via Zoom, let me know, and there's a link that I can send you, and you can, actually, we could maybe go ahead and send that out to everybody now. It doesn't matter. We have up to 100 users that can come in on it, so maybe I'll have Amy send that out to, I don't know if she has everyone's email address. If anyone needs to get an email address to Amy, then I will send that on to her and she can send it out. And I've got the classes set up for every Wednesday till the end of April when I leave, but that's not, my intention is not to have this text all the way through to then. And my intention is also not to teach every Wednesday. There will be some Wednesdays when we won't have class. But just know that when she sends that out, that'll include all of those Wednesdays. And then you can link in anytime if you're traveling and want to tune in on the Wednesday night class or whatever. That would be fine. You're more than welcome. So, yes, Rowena. December 19th will be the last class before the holiday break, and then we'll reconvene around January 9th, I think it is, because it would be January 2nd, I think, will also be a day we won't have class. So. And there's no questions from the folks online, so let's conclude. All right. Let's go to page 235. Let's recite the 2 verses as usual, dedicating for the result of complete enlightenment for ourselves and for all sentient beings, and then recalling bodhicitta and how important it is that this mind be cultivated very deeply in our own hearts and in the hearts of all beings. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Then page 244, we'll do the 2 prayers as usual for His Holiness and Lama Zopa. As we recite these 2 prayers, make strong intention for all our spiritual guides to have good health and long lives. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers, honoring the 3 jewels. Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And finally, just dedicate for those that you're holding in your heart right now. We can think in particular about the people who are suffering from the fires out in California, as well as other places in the world where there is man-made harm, harm from the elements and so on. We can also dedicate for Amy's friend Connor, who died on the 29th. And if there are others that we're holding in our hearts right now, bring them to mind. Those who are experiencing obstacles or illness, who have died or who are dying at this time. And just send out this positive energy so these beings can become free from their suffering and find all the causes that will lead them to perfect happiness. And may all beings find true peace and happiness through our efforts here tonight. Okay, terrific. Thank you all very much.